Joining me is Brad Friedman, investigative journalist and blogger at bradblog.com. Brad, we haven't been talking that much about voter fraud outside of so-called voter fraud within voter ID, which of course isn't really a problem and won't really be stopped by voter ID laws anyway. But before we talk about that, you're all over the voting machines and that side of the voter fraud angle. What do we need to be looking at for the 2012 election? Where are the areas of concern? Take it from there.
Well, for the most part, you need to get the word voter fraud out of your vocabulary. And we're talking about both the front-end voter suppression stuff that you're seeing with these photo ID restrictions, as well as the back-end stuff with the voting machines and whether your vote will actually be counted at all, much less counted accurately and transparently in a way that you can know it has been counted accurately. So voter fraud is not the concern. The concern is election fraud, insider election fraud. People who have access to the system, whether it be to the voting rolls that can and are being purged across the country, or to the electronic tabulators at the back end, which within a few seconds and a few keystrokes can flip an entire election. You have to keep your eyes on the things that are difficult to look at. For example, the electronic tabulation of votes. That's frankly impossible to look at, and that's a great concern of mine because even though we have paper ballots across about 2/3 of the country, almost none of those paper ballots are actually counted by human beings. They're counted by machines that are often just wrong. They just fail. They give they name losers to be the winners in elections, or they can be manipulated by insiders.
Okay, now with regard to the presidential election and the results, certainly if all of a sudden Mitt Romney wins California, huge red flag, obvious glaring error. So really I'm guessing that the areas where this could turn the election are going to be focused on swing states, and probably it's even going to be, am I wrong if I say, certain counties where for some reason something about those particular counties will make it more nebulous, more difficult to know whether, hey, a few votes here in this county, a few vote here, all of a sudden you swung a swing state.
Yeah, it's actually not just a few counties. It's pretty much every county in America. And by the way, I wouldn't be so sure, if California suddenly goes to Mitt Romney, I wouldn't be so sure that suddenly people determine that something's wrong. Remember, you had a guy, Alvin Green, who nobody had ever heard of, who didn't do any campaigning, who had no money, who had no website, who was announced the winner of the South Carolina Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate back in 2010. And, nobody blinked an eye. They said, well, I guess there's a reason that people voted for Alvin Green, who nobody had ever heard of. I suspect if, in a case where Mitt Romney were to win California, what you would see is not people saying, well, how did that happen? What went wrong? Were the votes counted accurately? Instead, you'd see people saying, well, Mitt Romney is, popular out west because of the Mormons. They'll find reasons to backwards engineer Mitt Romney winning California and test, try to figure out what went wrong in their pre-election polls rather than question if the actual results were tabulated correctly. We see this time and time again. We saw it as recently up in Wisconsin. During the historic gubernatorial recalls up there at the end of the night, 8 p.m. when the polls closed, all the news networks were telling you that their exit polling taken neck. It was going to be a long night. Get your popcorn. This thing may go until morning. As a matter of fact, more voters supported Barack Obama in that recall than Mitt Romney by like 11 points. And yet, 30 minutes later, Scott Walker wins in a landslide. And nobody can explain it. And nobody actually bothered to count any of the ballots cast across the entire state of Wisconsin, even though those paper ballots were tabulated on the very same machines that just 2 months earlier in Palm Beach County, Florida, actually named several losing candidates to be the winners. The computers named the wrong candidates to be the winners. We only found that out in Florida because the election director down there bothered to actually count some of those paper ballots. Meanwhile, up in Wisconsin, Nobody counted any ballots. They simply relied on whatever the computers told them, no matter how strange the result actually seemed when the computers told it to them.
If we tie in now the recent voter suppression idea that we're seeing on voter ID, I mean, people being purged from the rolls in Florida and a number of other states, it seems to me that if you want to steal an election, the much more under the radar way to do it is through the technology rather than through removing people from the voter rolls, because they're going to make noise. At least some of them are going to try to vote. They're going to be told you're not registered, whatever. That is a much easier way to make news, I think, than by very quietly manipulating the technology. So I'm curious, in your opinion, why are we seeing this effort on voter ID when you're going to see much more of a public outcry to that, whereas with the technology theft, maybe nobody even knows?
Well, first, it's not voter ID. We need to get that word just out of our vocabulary.
All my vocabulary is wrong today, Brad.
I know, but it's important, actually, because this has been a long con by the Republicans, and they're counting on folks to call it voter ID, which sounds quite reasonable. And, in fact, it is quite reasonable. Most states already have voter ID requirements. In fact, every state in the union, by federal law, the Help America Vote Act, requires first-time voters to show voter ID if they don't register in person. Voter ID in and of itself is not a problem. Bank statements, paycheck stubs, driver's license, all sorts of reasonable things to identify yourself. People hear voter ID and they say, yeah, what's wrong with that? In truth, nothing is wrong with that. What is wrong is polling place photo ID restrictions, these very narrowly tailored state-issued photo ID restrictions. Only certain types of photo IDs are allowable, the types that the Republicans know huge numbers of Democratic-leaning voters simply do not have. The elderly, minority, students, the poor, and so forth. So these are photo ID restrictions. That's the concern. As far as your original question, you know, these are sort of two sides of the same coin. If you can keep people from being able to cast their legal vote, and you can do it legally, so to speak, you know, by passing these laws, making these requirements that we know will suppress tens, if not hundreds of thousands of votes, if you can do that legally on the front end, keep people from being able to vote at all legally, it makes a lot more sense than risking gaming the systems on the voting systems on the back end, risking a huge felony to try to game the system in something that can be traced back to you. So it's really two sides of the same coin. The Republicans are pulling out all the stops this year, and frankly, they need to. If they can shave off just a few percentage points, as you said, David, in a few key states and in a few key counties in those states, that can be enough to throw an entire national election. They know it. Problem is, I'm not sure if Democrats know it, and I'm quite certain that the corporate mainstream media doesn't know it. They don't have a clue about it, or if they do, they're simply unwilling to talk about it and let the electorate know about these concerns.
Okay, so last thing real quick. I want to make sure moving forward I'm using the right wording. So what I incorrectly referred to as voter fraud, what's the right way we should be discussing it? What's the right phrase?
Voter fraud is incredibly rare. That is not really a great threat to our elections. The real threat to our elections is election fraud, specifically insider election fraud. That's one term. The other term, voter ID, forget about it. The concerns here are polling place photo ID restrictions. If you want to use a shorter word for it, voter suppression at the polling place.
Okay, great. I'm going to adjust my vocabulary moving forward. We've been speaking with Brad Friedman, investigative journalist and blogger. The website is bradblog.com. I get his newsletters. I don't know if daily, but I get everything you send, I think I'm getting, and it's all great stuff. So thanks again, Brad.
Thanks, Dave, for all you do, my friend. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's take a break. Stay tuned. Plenty more after this.